Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I'm going to be covering humanoids today. Today's episode is called It Was Not Human. 7 Shocking Humanoid Encounters. And yes, believe me, these are quite shocking, very unusual cases. These 7 cases come from all over the world. I've got 4 from the United States, including California, Michigan, North Carolina, and Ohio, and 3 from outside of the United States, including England, Argentina, and Brazil. These do cover quite a long period of time. The earliest is 1955, and the latest is 2022. So yeah, a good period of time there. All different types of ETs. We do see grays, we do see human-looking ETs, some very unusual-looking ones as well. I also am happy to say that a number of these cases are multiple witness cases. Also, quite a bit of supporting evidence, the 4 main types of evidence we often see, which include physiological effects, electromagnetic disturbances, animal reactions, and of course, landing traces. And I really dug deep in a lot of these cases, so it's not just a singular incident in most of these. I went down the rabbit hole, and some of these rabbit holes had rabbit holes themselves. So yeah, I really dug deep on this one. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. First case I'd like to talk about, I call the Loveland Humanoids. This took place on May 25, 1955, technically in Branch Hill, Ohio, but this is right on the border of Loveland. And I must say, it is one of several cases in this area, which is not a huge city by any means. So I think you'll find this one particularly unusual. And yeah, so many cases going on here. I'm not exactly sure why, but it sure is interesting. This case involves at least 5 humanoid reports. The first comes from Leonard Stringfield and Ted Bletcher, both respected researchers. The witness is Robert Hunnicutt, a restaurant worker. He was at first anonymous, but we now know his real name. It was about 3:30 a.m. on May 25, 1955, as Robert was driving north on the Madera-Loveland Pike. He was very close to Hopewell Road, you can see it here, and coming down a slight grade in the road, his headlights illuminated what he first thought were 3 men kneeling down on the berm along the right side of the road. And as he says, my first impression was that there were 3 crazy guys praying by the side of the road, or somebody was hurt, or some crazy guys were having fun. So he was curious and wondering what 3 guys would be doing praying in the middle of the night along the highway. He stopped his car about 20 feet away from them and looked at them. And that's when he realized that these figures were not human. He said they were shorter than normal people. They were in a triangular position facing the road. One was closer to the shoulder and the other 2 were kind of flanking behind him. But this closest figure had his arms and hands over his head and appeared to be holding some kind of rod. In fact, Robert could see electric blue-white sparks jumping back and forth from one hand to the other, just above and below this rod-like instrument. And Robert had the impression that these beings were concentrating on a spot on the other side of the road. So he became even more curious and exited his vehicle. Immediately, the closest forward figure lowered his arms and appeared to attach this object to his ankles. Now Robert was still standing next to the driver's side door when all 3 of these figures turned to their left and stared directly at him. And he could now see them in detail. Each figure, he said, was about 3.5 feet tall. They had gray skin and gray clothes. They had normal eyes, but no eyebrows that he could see. He didn't really notice any nose, but their mouths, he said, crossed the entire lower section of the face, and they had no lips. He also said that they had bald heads with what looked like rolls of fat running across the forehead, and smooth gray faces. He said that they were, quote, fairly ugly, and that their faces kind of reminded him of a frog's face. Their bodies were also unusual. The right side of their chest appeared to be swollen out larger than the left, giving them a sort of lopsided, asymmetrical appearance. and their right arms looked longer than their left arms. He said their gray clothes were tight-fitting except for a heavier section below the waist. So he's staring at them for a full minute or more and became even more curious. So he walked to the front of his car and stared in absolute wonder. He said he was more amazed than afraid. But as he reached the front of the car, the three humanoids moved a little closer to him with a movement that he said was both, quote, peculiar and graceful. He said he felt as if, quote, they were motioning me not to come any closer. So he stared at them for another few minutes, and then suddenly, he's not sure how this happened, the next thing he knew, he was back in his car driving to the Loveland police station, just a few miles away. Now in his car, he smelled an unusual and very powerful odor, which he described as a mixture of, quote, fresh cut alfalfa with a slight trace of almonds. So he drives straight to the Loveland Police Department and reports his experience to Police Chief John K. Fritz. Now Robert, according to Sergeant Fritz, he said he, quote, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Robert explained to him how he had seen these little men alongside the road and that they had, quote, fire coming out of their hands. This is what Sergeant Fritz said. He also complained to him of a terrible odor. Now here's where it gets interesting, because earlier that same evening at 7:48, Chief Fritz had actually received UFO reports in the area coming from Charlotte Whitecotton, who herself was a member of the Ground Observer Corps, a trained observer. She, along with another observer, reported seeing 4 flying saucers from their GOC post on Lebanon Road in Loveland. Mind you, this is a mile or two at most from where Robert Hunnicutt had his humanoid sighting. And per Charlotte Whitecotton, these craft were so low that they feared for their safety and actually fled their enclosure. And reportedly, the Air Force scrambled a jet to intercept these objects. Now, Chief Fritz knew Robert Hunnicutt personally, and he could see that this man was frightened and sincere, so he told him to go home, and he got in his cruiser and searched the area, but did not see anything. But it wouldn't be long before other people in this area began to report seeing strange creatures. It was one evening in July of 1955, very close to this time, Emily Magnone and her husband were in their home in Loveland Heights. This is about 3 miles maybe from the location of Robert Hunnicutt's encounter. And they said they were awakened by their dog who was barking outside and, quote, setting up a terrible fuss. So they looked out their window and they didn't see anything. But they did smell an extremely strong and penetrating odor, which they said was, quote, like a swamp. In fact, it was so powerful that although it was a hot night, they closed the window to keep the smell out. Meanwhile, their dog continued to bark, and this very powerful smell still permeated their home. Now, the next morning, they learned that their neighbors, a married couple, had also heard the dog barking, so the wife got up and stepped out onto the back porch, and to her amazement, only about 15 feet away from her, she saw a, quote, little man. She said he appeared to be about 3 feet tall and looked to her like it was covered with twigs and foliage. So she stepped back inside to turn on the porch light to get a better view, and looking outside, this creature was gone. So she turned the light off, and this strange little being appeared again, standing immobile in the same exact spot. She turned on the light a second time, looked back, and this creature was gone again. And in fact, she did this a few more times, each time with the same result. When the light was on, this creature would disappear, but when the light was turned off, it would apparently come back. Very strange. Now, a third little man report in Loveland also occurred one evening in July of 1955. The witness is in this case a Loveland auxiliary police officer by the name of Carlos Flanagan, age 19. He was also initially anonymous, but we do now know his real name. Now, by coincidence, he worked also with Police Chief John K. Fritz. And on the evening in question, Carlos was driving a civil defense truck over a bridge spanning the Little Miami River. And as he did, he noticed 4 small figures on the riverbank beneath the bridge. Now, he said that these little humanoids were, quote, more or less human-looking little men about 3 feet high. But he said that they had been, quote, moving about oddly. He said they were huddled in a group. They both had an odd appearance and an odd behavior. Now, he also noticed a terrible odor. He said that he saw them only for a matter of seconds, maybe 10 seconds or so. He rushed back to the police station. By chance, Officer Fritz was not there that night, and Carlos was met with nothing but laughter from his coworkers. There are a few details about what he saw because, per Carlos, he made a report to the newspapers and was mercilessly ridiculed, and he says he ended up being forced to quit his job. Now, per Chief Fritz, Carlos Flanagan had asked him for a higher position, which Fritz denied for lack of experience, and says that Carlos resigned his position. Now, per Leonard Stringfield, who did research this case, he heard that there was an armed guard placed at the bridge, and that the government also showed interest and investigated this incident. As he says, this is Leonard Stringfield, I did learn from a member of the school board of that community that the incident had been investigated by the FBI. Now, he also said that Loveland had more than just a few UFO reports in 1955. As Leonard Stringfield writes, just north of the city, in the town of Loveland, members of the GOC were reporting a heavy concentration of UFOs to the Columbus Air Filter Center. Strange brilliant objects were frequently sighted hovering low over the residential sections, and on one occasion, a lone metallic disc was seen during daylight hours hovering not far from the GOC observation tower. So this is quite a lot going on here. And consider this report from a Loveland resident by the name of Carol No, who contacted APRO. She says that she was 9 or 10 years old, and that in 1954 or 1955, which would be when all of this was going on, one summer evening, she and her cousin Freddie, age 12 or 13, were sitting on the porch of their Loveland home when they saw a, quote, bright star. This was obviously up in the sky, but it clearly wasn't a star because it was moving. They said it was not only unusually bright, it was an aqua green-blue color. As Carol says, then it abruptly changed directions. By this time, Freddie and I were curious beyond cautious and ran up the road following the object. So they could see now that it had a round appearance. They eventually lost sight of it and ran home and told her parents that they had seen a flying saucer. Sadly, they were met with laughter and teasing. Another witness is Ted Ogden, who says that sometime in the early 1960s, his young son came running into their home in Loveland and said, "Dad, there's a flying saucer outside." They ran outside, and sure enough, there was a flying saucer, kind of. Actually, it was a silver cigar-shaped object, which Ted estimates was about 7 feet long, maybe 2 feet wide, traveling silently and slowly overhead. So Loveland is the town that just keeps on giving. Get this case. 1 a.m., March 3rd, 1972, Officer Ray Shockey was driving slowly along the icy Riverside Road towards Loveland when he saw what he first thought was a dog. So he stopped his car and looked at this dog, what he thought was a dog, in his headlights, and to his shock, this dog wasn't a dog, but instead a humanoid of some kind. He says it stood up, its eyes were shining from the car headlights. He said it was about 4 feet tall with leathery skin and a face that looked more frog-like or lizard-like than human. He said it looked at him for a few seconds, then turned and leaped over the guardrail, sliding into the Little Miami River. So he fled the scene and returned with his fellow officer, Mark Matthews. But of course, by this time, this creature, whatever it was gone. They said they saw evidence of something scraping along the embankment into the river. Now, 2 weeks later, while driving along this same stretch of road, Officer Mark Matthews said he saw something lying on the road. He stopped his cruiser and opened the door, and apparently hearing the door opening, this creature in the road jumped up assumed a defensive crouched position and keeping its gaze fixed on the officer, showing a kind of smirk on its face. It half walked, half hobbled to the guardrail and disappeared over the guardrail and was gone. Now, both these officers initially insisted upon anonymity, and both agreed that the drawing made by investigators, which you can see here, was accurate. And Mark Matthews told them, the researchers, quote, "I wish this had never happened." Now, years later, Officer Mark Matthews backpedaled this entire story, said it was all a hoax, and that what he had actually seen was an iguana missing its tail, and that he had actually shot it and put the body in his trunk. That's what he says. It's kind of strange that these two police officers would risk their careers to perpetrate such a detailed hoax and maintain it for so long. And I would mention, they said it was 20 degrees that night, which is a bit cold for an iguana. But at that time, they were by all accounts serious about what they had seen. So I don't know. You can make up your own mind about it. They were the witnesses. They know best what happened. And it doesn't negate the many other reports of humanoids in this area, and of course the accompanying UFO sightings. And there are more. Consider this very interesting Loveland case from MUFON field investigator Connie McNichols. A man by the name of Terry was driving with his friend on Butterworth Road off State Route 48 at 9:40 p.m. on February 17, 2008. And as he drove, his car engine slowly lost power and died. So he got out of the car and checked under the hood, and this is when he heard a strange rustling noise in the nearby cornfield. And looking in that direction, he saw a, quote, "massive dull light" rising up out of the cornfield. Now his friend back in the car was terrified. She remained in the car. But Terry said that this light was actually an object about 10 to 15 feet wide, 10 feet high, with a kind of, quote, faded black color. He said it had many smaller lights in the front. He said it hovered, made a soft humming sound, and then it approached him, hovering only about 15 feet overhead. And he could now see that on the bottom side of this craft were about a dozen lines of light, like, quote, neon fiber optic cables. That's how he described them. He said they glowed and changed colors from white to yellow to orange and red. The craft itself now appeared to have a deep blue color, which he said shimmered almost like water. He could feel a tingling sensation permeating his entire body, and he said the hairs on his body, quote, stood on end. Now this object hovered for a few minutes, then tilted at an angle. It became completely quiet and shot off like a dart, turning bright red. He said it stopped again in the distance, zigzagged, stopped again, made a series of loop-de-loop maneuvers before finally disappearing off to the east in a flash. The entire encounter lasted 20 minutes. He returned to his car, which started normally. His friend remained frightened. She does not want to talk about it. But Terry himself has a 13-year military background, and as he says, "I cannot explain it. I'm still dumbfounded, yet I feel a sense of awe and a serious sense of underachievement. I was never scared, more shocked at what I was witnessing. It truly was a spectacular moment in my life, and I don't care if people believe me or not, but someone needs to know." There you go. That's about all I could find out in terms of UFO activity in Loveland. Really not sure what to make of the police officer case and the so-called frogman. I don't know. Perhaps it is, as they say, a prank or a hoax, a strange thing for police officers to do and to maintain for so many years. But I'll leave it to you to decide. I think some of those cases are absolutely legitimate. Leonard Stringfield is a fantastic researcher. He's very highly respected. And with so much UFO activity going on there, in some cases going on at that exact moment that Robert Hunnicutt had his encounter, I think we can count that one as pretty credible. So let's move on to the next case, which I call Something Horrible Was Out There. This is a really interesting, series of cases really. The first occurring on November 13, 1967 in Surrey, United Kingdom. and super interesting because these cases do involve humanoids, and there's no overt UFO connection, meaning the witnesses themselves didn't see UFOs, but people saw them in the surrounding area, so entirely possible these were ETs, given the description of these humanoids that these people saw. So yeah, this I think is a really interesting series of events. This case comes from pioneering researcher Charles Bowen, author of The Humanoids, which is actually one of the first books to cover humanoid cases. It was a half hour after midnight on November 13, a damp, cloudy night, as the witness, Philip Freeman, age 22, and the other witness, his friend, Angela Carter, age 20, were driving along a country road through the Winterfold Forest. This is just a few miles north of Cranleigh, and they were heading towards Pitch Hill and eventually to their home in Woking. This is in the UK. So he stopped the car to wipe the windshield of the dampness, and this is when both he and Angela became aware of an awful, revolting smell. He kind of compared it to burned food. So he returned to the car and started talking about this awful odor. And this is when he was shocked and alarmed to see a weird face very close up to Angela's side of the car. This face had no features that he could see, but was just pure white. He saw that one of its arms was raised up to touch the hood of the car. And when he saw all this, he says he felt a wave of coldness and fear. Now, Angela was looking at him at the time, and she saw his face. She was too scared to turn around and look outside. As she said, "I knew by the look on Philip's face, and by my own feeling, that something horrible was out there." So Angela began to plead with Philip to drive away. Now, this car was a stick shift, and it took a moment to get the car in gear. And by this time, the figure had moved to the back window, and Philip could now see that it had a dark, cloaked body, and that it was about 4.5 feet tall. Philip drove off, stopped the car a few hundred yards up the road. Now the smell, which had been stronger inside the car than outside, now dissipated, and Philip asked Angela if she wouldn't mind turning around and going back to investigate. Angela, no surprise, would not hear of it, and told him to keep driving to their home in Woking as quickly as possible, which they did. Philip shared his experience with his family and friends and was met with skepticism and teasing, though his parents did admit to researchers that Philip was truly frightened. And it turns out this area does have quite an interesting history of strange phenomena. In fact, one man described a sighting way back in the 1920s along Red Road in Woking, and said that he was followed by a light. Another apparent humanoid sighting occurred one night in January or February of 1968. A young man, Peter, and his girlfriend had parked their car between Woking and Guildford in Surrey when he got an uneasy feeling. And he looked up, and this is when he saw a, quote, shadow behind some trees. He couldn't see it clearly, so he started to get out of his car to look, and he watched this shadowy figure glide closer to him, approaching about 20 feet away, and he could now see that it was about 4.5 feet tall, not human, he said. It was too, quote, squat and square to be human, not to mention the fact that it moved in perfect silence. And like the being seen by Philip, he couldn't see any legs. So they drove off quickly, and reportedly 2 weeks later, they went to the same area and smelled also a terrible odor, which Peter described as, quote, seaweed rotting in the hot sun. So there does appear to be something going on here. In September of 1973, a 4-year-old boy in Kingfield, Woking in Surrey told his parents that he saw a 6-fingered, headless humanoid figure wearing dark gray clothing and a belt at the foot of his bed. It seemed to be holding something like a radio in its hand. It quickly vanished, and looking to his doorway, he saw 6 similar figures, who also promptly vanished. He jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, and this is when he said he saw a domed disc with square portholes landed on the lawn outside his home. In fact, he saw that these entities that he had seen in his room were now climbing up a ladder inside this craft. So he ran to get his mother, but when they returned to the window, this object was gone. Now, just 2 months later, on November 2nd, 1973, a Mrs. Rufignac was driving near Chobham when she said she saw a rectangular-shaped object that had many flashing colored lights and was moving silently. Get this, only about 30 feet above the ground. Lots going on here. Here are a couple of more cases. In February of 1978, Miss Lynn Price was in Chertsey, just a bit to the north, when she and 2 others saw a long, glowing object flying at very low elevation and 2 or 3 times the speed of a normal aircraft. And as she says, "My friend and I are very down-to-earth people, and we really don't know what to make of it. One of the men with her is a pilot, and he said, quote, was definitely not an airplane." Months later, in October of 1978, 5 separate groups of police officers reported seeing up to 7 multicolored UFOs in this same area. And in January of 1984, there was another wave of sightings over Woking. There were at least 4 witnesses. One who said he saw something over Woodham Lane, a red light which he said was, quote, much larger than an aircraft, and I braced myself for the sound of a crash, but nothing happened. Another witness said she saw, quote, 3 bright lights in a perfect triangle hovering over the Manor Farm estate at Byfleet. That is quite a few humanoid encounters in one particular place over a pretty short period of time. Here's an interesting tidbit. Woking in the UK is actually the location for H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. So make of that what you will, but it's certainly an interesting fact. And again, just goes to show that these humanoid cases are pretty much everywhere. And I've said it before, but it bears repeating. So few people report their encounters. The stranger the encounter, the less likely a person is to report it. So kudos to all who have the strength and courage to come forward and share what they've experienced, because you can bet other people are experiencing it too. So now let's move to the next case. This one was really gripping, very unusual. I hadn't heard it before, but I thought it was an important case. That's why I wanted to include it in this compilation. I call this one, I Was Glued to the Ground. This took place on July 22nd, 1968 in Mendoza, Argentina. And it's a really interesting single witness case, but it turns out other people did see activity in that exact area at that time. So I guess technically it's not a single witness case. Single witness in terms of one person seeing humanoids. But what's also interesting is not only did people see UFOs on that same night, other people were seeing humanoids in this area around that time. And in fact, 1968 was a huge wave of activity for Argentina. So I'm going to be covering some of those cases as well. But I think you'll find this particular case involving a nurse really compelling. It's such an unusual case. It does have physiological effects and landing traces as well. This amazing case was widely published in newspapers, in England's Flying Saucer Review, in France's publication Lumière dans la Nuit, and many other publications. The witness is a 45-year-old nurse by the name of Adela Casalvieri de Panaciti. It was 1:20 a.m. on July 22nd, 1968, and Adela was on night duty at the Carlos Pereira Neuropsychiatric Hospital, located at 2837 Ituzaingó Street in Mendoza, Argentina. You can see it here. She was in the main office preparing medication for the patients when a strange noise enveloped her. And I'll just quote her directly. As Adela says, I heard a loud noise, a loud buzzing sound that deafened me, and I went out into the courtyard because I thought the gas from the stove was bothering me. So I went out to the patio. I thought the noise would go away. When I went out into the courtyard, they, meaning the UFO, shone a beam of light on me. And after that, I heard no more noise. Then I put my hands to my face. I wanted to take them off to see what it was, but I couldn't, because they were aiming so hard that I couldn't. The noise was deafening enough to hurt your ears. Now, all Adela knew was that some kind of vehicle had apparently landed about, she estimates, 60 feet away and was shining an intensely brilliant beam of red light on her, which was causing this terrible noise and radiating a powerful heat. She wanted to move, but as she says, I was paralyzed from the ground up. I couldn't move. I felt like I was glued to the ground. She said the light from this object was so bright it lit up the entire courtyard and building, and the heat from the beam was very intense. As she says, like when the sun is hot or when you pass next to a boiler. After just a few moments, this beam retracted, the deafening sound stopped, and looking towards the source of the beam, she saw this object rising up from the ground, slowly and vertically, from the center of this very large hospital courtyard. She could now see that it was a shiny silver metallic craft, shaped kind of like a hat, she said, several meters wide and glowing very brightly. She said the bottom section revolved rapidly. The upper section had a dome which was covered with colored lights, and she also saw several small squarish windows on the craft, and looking through these windows she saw people. As Adela says, it was going away, rising very slowly. Then I saw people moving inside the object. There were a few figures moving around. The people inside weren't clearly visible. I saw through the windows that some were going this way and others that way. It wasn't clear because it was quite far away, but the people inside were clearly visible. Their heads weren't visible, just half their bodies. But I saw these people inside walking. There wasn't just one, but several, some walking this way and others that way, inside. So as this object rose, this deafening sound returned, and after rising above the brick walls surrounding the courtyard, this object zoomed away at high speed. Adela screamed for help and started to run back into the hospital, but her legs gave away. She collapsed to her knees. She now detected a strong smell of sulfur in the air. Her co-workers were in a ward in the hospital at the time of this incident. They didn't hear this object or see any lights, but they did hear her screaming, and they arrived to help her. They also noticed this very strong odor of sulfur, which seemed to be coming from a stain or a mark on the courtyard exactly where this craft had landed. Now, the evidence of this remained there, and in fact, the plants next to the landing site were burned. A pepper tree was burned all the way to the ground, and Adela herself suffered from first-degree burns on her hands, her face, her neck, and she says the whole right side of her body. Also, her wool hat was also burned. She was taken to the hospital and found to be okay. She was also taken for psychological testing and found to be normal and healthy. Her, Adela, an Air Force doctor, came to examine her, and he told her that her rings and her watch, which had stopped at precisely 1:30, all tested positive for radioactivity. Also, the landing site tested positive for radioactivity. This stained mark remained for about 2 days. And another detail, when the courtyard was sprayed with water, it would dry more quickly exactly where the craft had landed. Reportedly, military officials took samples of the cement and the burned tree branches for analysis. This analysis was never released to the public. But here's another strange thing. On that night of the encounter, before the encounter happened, the patients in the hospital were unusually quiet and well behaved. Remember, this is a psychiatric hospital. And per Adela, there's usually quarreling and shouting and people getting up to walk around or get water. But the night of that encounter, she said, quote, "The block was in perfect silence. The discipline was perfect." Prior to the incident, Adela didn't believe in UFOs, but afterwards she said, "Yes, now I believe." And later, an additional possible witness was found. The night watchman at the nearby hotel on Santiago del Estero Street said that he saw this object land and then take off shortly later. And reportedly, the daughters of Commander Victoria at a nearby Garrison casino said that on the same night they saw a luminous egg-shaped object emitting red, blue, and orange-colored lights moving rapidly across the sky. So as it turns out, Adela's encounter was not an isolated event. Some 400 miles away and 4 days later, in Oliveira, Argentina, another startling encounter involving humanoids occurred. This one was about 2 a.m. on July 25. A police corporal heard a loud droning noise, and he saw a bright luminosity. This is by the Tapalque stream. You can see it here. He was about to change guard, but instead he rushed back to the station. A police officer there authorized an investigation, and the corporal returned with 4 other officers. They were given a jeep and an automatic gun, and they drove to this spot where he had seen the craft. And when they arrived, they were astonished to see a large oval object emitting multicolored lights only a few meters above the ground, and it was darting around a little bit. As they watched, it moved at incredible speed, turned sideways, and then landed behind some bushes behind a runway used by military planes. At this point, this brilliant craft dimmed in luminosity. This loud droning sound lessened to a soft hum, and looking beside this disk, the officers could now see 3 strange beings, each about 6 feet high, wearing silver-colored uniforms. And these beings began to slowly advance towards the officers. Now this frightened the officers, and one of them, Corporal Menendez, took the gun and fired a volley of bullets. The strange beings immediately lifted their hands, revealing a small, glowing sphere, and immediately all the officers were overcome by a powerful feeling of tiredness that they said rendered them incapable of using their guns. The 3 beings returned to the disc. It rose upwards, zigzagged a few times, and darted off at high speed. Immediately, the officers recovered and returned to their station to report this incident. Now, on that same day at 5:30 a.m., July 25, her researcher Roberto Banks, a gentleman by the name of Oscar Augustin D'Onofrio, was traveling along Route 3 near the city of General Alvear. This is in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He was at the 37-kilometer mark when he says, about 300 feet off the road, he noticed an increasing luminosity. His car engine failed, he was unable to move, and he could now see that this light was actually a craft of some kind which appeared to be emitting sparks. He saw 2 figures nearby, but they were too far away to see any real detail. He did see them return into the craft, which took off and darted away, at which point his car started working again. And that same day, another gentleman in La Pastora, Argentina, said that he saw a silvery, spinning, top-shaped object hovering near the road. Again, his car failed. The object rose upward and moved off, and his car restarted. A lot was going on. It was about 2 weeks after that, on August 9, 1968, that UFOs returned to the city of Mendoza. Police officer Arsenio Romero from the 5th Precinct in Mendoza was 6 miles away from where Adela had her encounter. This is at the zoo in Cerro de la Gloria. Suddenly the zoo animals and dogs were acting up, and he said about 200 feet away from him he saw a brilliantly lit craft. As Arsenio says, it was like a flying saucer, with a part in the middle that looked like it was made of glass, resting on 3 little legs. Flashes of different colors came out of it, spinning around intermittently. First they were blue-yellowish on the edge. They were bluish-green. These lights were very bright, stronger than the sun, although metallic in appearance. He said the object was kind of shaped like a child's top, but had a transparent dome on top. And as Arsenio says in his own words, I got closer out of curiosity. When I got there, I saw these people coming out, bellowing as they left the platform. It was a loud buzzing sound, almost a bellow, difficult to compare. It was dry, harsh, a loud high-pitched whistling sound that made my ears hurt. The lights also bothered me, but they didn't blind me, although as I got closer, a sulfurous smell became more noticeable, causing me distress. These beings were surrounding the saucer. They didn't touch the ground. Now, per Arsenio, these beings had tall, elongated heads, and it looked to him like they were rotating around the craft. So he pulls out his gun, at which point he became completely paralyzed. He says, I tried to walk forward, backward, but I couldn't. I tried to move my arms, but I couldn't. I couldn't scream or speak either, and I felt a burning sensation on my body in front of me, and I fell to the ground. Per Arsenio, when he fell to the ground, it was because a blue-violet beam was shown on him from this UFO or these beings. He fell paralyzed to the ground and passed out. He was found later by a stranger, woken up and rushed to a nearby hospital where he says he remained for 4 days, suffering from nervous upset and pain in his shoulders, elbows, and knees. Now reportedly, landing traces were found at the site. You can see the photograph here. Arsenio speculates that the ETs were coming to gather uranium, as the area of Mendoza is known to have rich uranium deposits. Few more encounters. The same day as Adela Calvieri's encounter at 2 p.m., July 22nd, 1968, this is 12 hours after her encounter, pilots, police officers, and airport personnel at the San Carlos de Bariloche Airport near Bahia Blanca were puzzled by the appearance of a, quote, excessively long plane. They said it had swept back short delta-like wings, which were far, far too short to support a craft of its enormous size. It began circling the airport runway at about 200 feet altitude, as if searching for a place to land. But the problem was the plane made no radio contact and was also making very bizarre maneuvers. Per the witnesses, it was somewhat similar to a Canberra jet, but it had no windows. It did have black squares, or what looked like black squares, painted on its side, and although many people viewed it through binoculars, nobody could identify this aircraft. And despite its large size, it glided about with obvious grace and ease, and very little engine noise. And right when it looked like it was about to land, it sped away at high speed. Now more reports could be cited. There's a lot of them, so I'll just quote a few. June 29, 4 people in San Luis del Palmar saw an object which went over their car, shaking it violently and actually making it go backwards. July 2nd, 5 people in Sierra Chica, Buenos Aires, saw a UFO zigzagging across the sky when it zoomed straight towards them and flew a few meters over their heads, causing them all to throw themselves to the ground, shot up and darted away. July 7, a man in Cuesta de las Vacas in San Juan was driving with his family when they said a 90-foot-long craft moved right across the road in front of them, only 3 feet above the road. July 16, 5 police officers saw a 6-foot-wide glowing blue craft which caused their Jeep to lose power. July 18, again in Mendoza, mind you, this is just 4 days before Adela's encounter, 4 teachers were driving when they encountered a red-orange oval object, 60 feet long, traveling just above the ground. They said it emitted an odor like damp paper, which became so strong that they had trouble breathing, and one witness suffered extreme sleepiness. One more, September 12, in Ceres, Santa Fe, Argentina, a small glowing red oval object was so low, per the witnesses, it was skimming just above the houses in the area. I could go on. As you can see, this is a very intense wave. How amazing is that? All that activity going on in the summer of 1968 in Mendoza, Argentina, and of course the surrounding areas. A really intense wave of UFO activity. That case at the hospital is particularly compelling, but I do think we need to consider the possibility that that was, in fact, humans inside a reverse-engineered craft. We really do need to consider all possibilities when looking at these cases. I think some of the cases are clearly ET, given the description of these very unusual-looking humanoids, but I'm just presenting the facts as we know them. You can make up your own minds about it. But now let's move to the next case, which is really interesting and undeniable, really. I call this one ETs at the Electrical Station. This occurred on July 23rd, 1968, around the same time as this wave in Argentina. This occurred in Bauru, Brazil. It's a fascinating case because of its location at this electrical station. As you may know, ETs do show an interest in nuclear power stations, hydroelectric dams, really any kind of technological installation. So that could be a factor here. Of course, if you take a look at this case, it might be humans as well inside of a reverse engineered craft. But whatever the explanation, it's certainly an interesting event. This case comes from respected researcher Dr. Walter K. Buehler and was published in the Brazilian publication, the SBEDV Bulletin, but it also appeared in numerous newspapers and in the APRO Bulletin. It was 1 a.m. on July 23, 1968, by coincidence a day after Adela Calsalvieri's encounter in Mendoza, that night watchman Deildo de Oliveira was on duty at the Central Electric Power Station located in Boró, São Paulo, Brazil. He was a new employee, he had only been working there for 15 days, and he was making his routine rounds when he noticed a figure standing in a dimly lit area near the entrance. And as he quietly approached, hoping not to be noticed, he heard a noise and saw another figure, who he saw was wearing dark clothes, peeking out from one of the windows of the little office there. Now realizing that these were men, trespassers, he grabbed a rod of iron and walked up to one of the figures quietly, who he assumed had its back to him. And 3 feet away from this figure, he swung the rod at this being and was surprised when this figure swiftly evaded him. And only then did he realize that this figure did not have his back to him, but was facing him wearing some kind of helmet. He said it wasn't, quote, a normal person. It was wearing an opaque helmet. Now instead of talking, this figure made loud grunting sounds and physically grabbed the witness and wrestled him to the ground. Now as Deildo fought the man, the second figure came running and joined the fray. Mind you, the witness is young and strong, and he continued fighting these 2 figures for about 10 minutes when a third figure appeared. Now this figure looked different. He had light-colored coveralls, very pale skin, red hair, which per Deildo was different and harder in texture than normal hair. This third figure grabbed the witness, pulled him to his feet. This caused the witness to lose his shoes in the struggle. This man tore at his clothes, struck his leg, causing Deildo to fall to the ground. And the 3 men basically ganged up on him, picked him up and threw him to the ground, he says 5 or 6 times, until he stopped resisting. Now defeated, the witness lay still. The figures poked him gently in the ribs a couple of times, apparently to make sure he was all right. That was his impression. And then the red-headed man pulled him up to his feet, patted his back in a friendly way, and communicated to him in some way to go away. Our fight here is over. Now per the witness, he now heard this red-headed figure speaking in an unintelligible language, and all 3 of these figures started to walk off. The witness, Deildo, walked cautiously away towards the nearby stairwell and began to shout for help. And looking back, he saw that these 3 men were approaching a small gray craft, about 30 feet wide, 45 feet high, which he said was shaped much like a Volkswagen van. They entered inside it, and this craft emitted a noise and rose upwards at an angle, causing a blast of cold air. It maneuvered next to a nearby electrical transformer, causing it to throw off some sparks. Then it zigzagged briefly, shot upwards quickly into the sky, and was gone. Now seeing this, Deildo, the witness, was now convinced that he had just encountered extraterrestrials. He ran to find Antonio, the security guard for the next shift, and together they searched the area. They found Deildo's torn clothing, his buttons, his shoes, his flashlights, several of the footprints from the men. They saw that one of the office doors had been apparently forced open. They of course notified authorities, and this led to a thorough investigation. An inspection of the office that had been broken into showed that nothing was missing, but they did find strange handprints on the file cabinet inside the office. News of this incident soon leaked out, and reporters came to interview the witness. Reportedly, the military took over the investigation, which was carried out in secret, and the results, of course, were never released to the public. The only real result of this incident was that the electric station personnel doubled the number of guards protecting this electric plant. That case is definitely a bit of an outlier. I don't know that I've heard any quite like it in terms of how the ETs, well, alleged ETs, were behaving, humanoids, the description of the craft, and so forth. It's an unusual event, but I do wonder if perhaps that was humans in a reverse engineered craft. I'm just saying this again because we can't be too careful. All right, now let's move to the next case, which I think is absolutely ET, given what the witness describes. I call this one, "It Scared the Hell Out of Me." This occurred in July 1972, in Pioneer Township, Michigan. This is largely a single witness case, though later the witness did have further encounters, including one with his mother. But this is a really unusual face-to-face encounter with a gray ET that has some particularly interesting elements to it. So that's why I wanted to share it with you today. The witness in this case is an anonymous young man at the time of his encounter, and he reported it later to MUFON, writing, "I swear these events happened, and I would not hesitate to take a lie detector test." He said it was around dusk, July 1972, and he was playing basketball by himself in the upper hayloft of the barn next to his home in Pioneer Township, Michigan. He had just taken a shot with the basketball, and this is when he noticed something in the lower hayloft. As he says, "I can only describe it as a tremendous amount of concentrated energy. At that moment, I could visibly see nothing, but I knew something was there. As I continued looking at that spot, a ball of pulsating light appeared, about the size of a softball, or maybe a little larger. My mind was trying to figure out what I was looking at. So he stepped to the right, and he could see that whatever this thing was, it was definitely sitting in the air there, pulsating. So he just stood there and stared at it as his mind scrambled to find an explanation for what he was seeing. And this is when suddenly the ball of energy expanded vertically, and out stepped a humanoid creature. As the witness says, I found myself facing a being with very large black eyes, a tiny nose, a slit for a mouth, very small flat ears, and very long fingers, 3 on each hand. I would say its height was less than 4 feet. It appeared to be very light complected. It scared the hell out of me, and I could feel some kind of energy hitting me in the lower forehead, as if it was trying to communicate or observe me. I was aware it was moving closer to me, and I ran. So he stormed into the house and told his mother that he had just seen a ghost, because at the time he had never heard of gray ETs. He didn't know how else to explain it. But events weren't over yet. A short time later, he and his mother were driving and came upon, quote, an orange ball of light sitting in the air. As they approached it, it suddenly disappeared, but neither of them were able to identify it. It was only 2 years later, in 1974, that the witness had another sighting. He said he was outside his home when a huge black triangular-shaped object with 3 lights at each apex and a panel of lights on the back stopped directly over his head. And as he says, this ship was easily 400 feet long. It sat above me for at least 10 minutes. I don't believe it could have been more than 100 feet off the ground. When this craft started to move, the large corner lights went to blue, green, and red. The rear lights flipped on in sequence, left to right. It moved away in a very slow northeast direction, with no sound or air movement. So these events still remain vivid in his mind 39 years later, when he reported it to the Mutual UFO Network. Can you imagine not reporting an event for some 39 years and then finally finding the courage to come forward? This is a pattern I see with so many witnesses. It takes a lot to process these kinds of events. Often people are alone with them. They can't even share it with their family or friends. Because who wants to be ridiculed? Who wants to be gaslit because of an experience they had? It's really unfair. I blame our own governments, secret governments. This cover-up is no joke. It's been very effective in silencing witnesses. Thankfully, that is changing, and a lot more people are coming forward. This is such an important subject. We all deserve to know the truth. I know you guys know this. But this is why I do this research, because so many people are having these experiences and many of them have no support system, no recourse, no place to get really good information on this subject. All right, let's move to the next case, which I call This Creature Was Not Human. This took place on November 10, 1986, in a very rural area of Clovis, California. I like this case because this witness describes her experience in very vivid detail. She's clearly quite intelligent. It's a really poignant encounter, actually, and I think you'll find it really compelling. This first-hand eyewitness testimony comes from Sarah. That is a pseudonym. Her parents owned a 20-acre ranch property on the outskirts of Clovis. This was near the intersection of Bullard and North Academy Avenue. You can see it here. Sarah was 20 years old at the time of her encounter. It was the night of November 10, 1986, when she stepped out onto the back porch facing north and noticed a strange blue-white light towards the nearby Friant Kern Canal, which bordered her parents' property. Now, she thought briefly it might be headlights on a car, but they clearly weren't that. They were too blue, didn't look like campers either, and as Sarah says, they were very pretty. The light was large and glowed outwards and filled the sky in the shape of a dome. So she was very curious about this because nobody ever went out to that area, and she decided that the next morning she would hike over there and investigate. But strangely, when morning came, she completely forgot about it. That night, the lights were back, and as Sarah says, same color, same spot. I told myself that for sure I would head out in the morning and investigate. So the next morning, after watching The Price is Right with her grandmother, it was around 11 a.m., she grabbed her rifle, which she normally used for rabbit hunting, got her golden retriever Sheena, and headed towards the canal runoff where she had seen these lights. It took her about 10 minutes to hike there, and as she stepped over a barbed wire fence marking the property line, something very strange happened. As Sarah says, that's when a fear hit me. It hit me out of nowhere. I found myself instantly scared. I have never been scared out there, especially with a rifle in my hand. The hair on my neck stood up, my shoulders raised and my head sunk into my neck. I looked left, then right, then all around me. Something inside of me was telling me to run. But Sarah bravely screwed up her courage, put her finger on the trigger of her .22 LR rifle, and walked the remaining 60 feet of the canal runoff as quickly as she could without running. And finding nothing, she headed back towards her property. The feeling of danger was still there, and she had the urge to keep walking, but for some reason, she says, she stopped. And this is when she realized that her dog Sheena, who would never normally abandon her, was suddenly gone. Sarah looked around her, and this is when her life changed forever. As Sarah says, I didn't want to look behind me for some reason. When I reluctantly looked behind me, I instantly spotted what I thought was a small child. Down near the opening in the dirt bank was a figure. I thought it was a boy about 8 or 9 years old. The figure was wearing all black from feet to neck. She could now see that this figure had a huge bald head and a thin body, and not only looked strange, it was dressed strangely. And Sarah slowly realized that this figure was not normal. As Sarah says, as I continued to stare, the large head of this figure clearly appeared bald, and the eyes were larger than expected, very large. This wasn't a little boy. There was something very foreign about this thing. Something inside of me recognized this creature as not human. Something felt wrong. At the time, Sarah had never heard of gray aliens, but later, seeing images on television and the internet, she realized that this creature was a typical gray. But at the time, all she knew is that this figure was not human. And as she says, that was when this big-headed figure raised its arm and seemed to wave at me. I wasn't sure if it was a hello or a goodbye. Sarah looked around to see if she could see her dog Sheena, and when she looked back towards this gray, it was gone. So she walked home quickly and was puzzled to find that her dog Sheena was already in her dog pen. She immediately asked her grandmother if she had put Sheena in the dog pen, and her grandmother said, "Yes, I did. Where have you been?" And Sarah said that she had taken a walk to the runoff, and her grandmother replied, "Well, you were gone a very long time." But Sarah protested. She said, "I was only gone for 15 minutes. But when she went into her room to put her rifle away, she was shocked to see that it was now 1:10 p.m. She was missing almost 2 hours of time. Now at the time, this was all so confusing that she just figured her clock must be wrong, and by the next day, she had actually completely forgot about the encounter. It wasn't until 1 year later when something strange happened which brought the memory back. She was sleeping in her bedroom when she was awakened by a brilliant blue light streaming in through her window. She wondered at first if it could be the police, but this didn't make any sense as her window faced the back part of the house where there was no road. And I'll just quote Sarah as she says, "I turned my head and looked to the footboard of my bed. A gray, as we now know them, was staring back at me. I noticed a huge head and big eyes. Its forehead seemed to shine in an oily way, as if it needed cleaning. I focused on its eyes. Its eyes opened wide as if surprised. I wasn't scared. I was in awe. I wonder to this day if it was mimicking me or not. Did its eyes widen as if surprised that I woke and noticed it? Or was it mimicking my surprise that it was there? After it opened its eyes wider in surprise, I apparently fell back to sleep." Now I've heard that same sort of mimicking thing that these grays do in almost a playful way, and that's exactly what she's describing. The next morning, Sarah searched her room, but the gray, of course, was gone. But the memory of this gray she saw a year earlier came back to her. And now, thinking back to her childhood, she remembered a particularly vivid dream at age 7 or 8 that she had always wondered about and she now realized could be connected to all this. As Sarah says, "I was staring out a window, looking down at a planet. I heard a voice say, 'That's your planet.' The scary part was, I felt like I was falling or about to fall out the window. The planet seemed so huge and so close. Why would I have this dream?" So following these two encounters with the Greys, Sarah recalls no further encounters, but does report that the encounter affected her profoundly. As she says, "Everything changed. I found myself looking up at the stars. I became interested in everything outer space. I started to research UFOs at the library. I went to Walden Books to find anything on abductions and aliens. I found the book by Bud Hopkins, and the cover scared the bleep out of me." So Sarah, like many witnesses, waited 34 years before she reported her encounter. There you go, another person who waited decades to report their encounter. And what an amazing encounter it was. And as we've seen, it's not a singular event. Events like these are rarely a one-off. Most people who have face-to-face contact with an ET or a humanoid probably have had other events. That's certainly true in her case. It's not always true, but it is a pattern I've certainly noticed. All right, let's move to the next case. Here's another one you probably haven't heard before. I call this one An Alien Beside My Bed. This occurred on August 25, 2022 in North Carolina. It's a particularly compelling case, which I found kind of interesting, having done a lot of research into UFO healings, and this witness does report a healing of a psychological condition, presumably psychological. Well, you can make up your own mind about this case, but I did find it really compelling. The witness in this case is anonymous. I call her Natalie. She has elected to keep both her name and her location private. We do know that it took place somewhere in North Carolina in the middle of the night on August 25, 2022. She had just woken up from a dream when she had her encounter with what appears to be a gray-type ET. As Natalie says, "I rolled over on my back and saw a short, dark figure with a big and wide head. It was completely cloaked in darkness, so that I couldn't make out any details of its face or body. It was on my right side, beside the edge of my bed, touching my knee." Now there was enough light coming from the street light outside that Natalie could clearly see that this being was not human. It stood perfectly still, and the second she saw it, she found herself paralyzed. She couldn't talk, but she said she was able to whisper to herself, It's an alien. It's an alien. Weirdly, when she did this, it sent her a telepathic image of a cell phone, which, as Natalie says, I think it was trying to tell me not to be afraid in some way. I wasn't afraid, just stunned and shocked. Now at this point, Natalie called out twice to the name of Jesus, and she says this being disappeared. And as Natalie says, it simply vanished as if it had never been there, and I could move again. Now she did discover an amazing and very positive after effect. As Natalie says, I've had terrible insomnia since high school. After this alien's visit, my lifelong insomnia was cured. Now I have no problems falling asleep. And that cure was permanent. She said she also developed a strong interest in UFOs and began to study this subject, and she initially believed that this cure was purely altruistic for her benefit, but fear crept in and she began to wonder if perhaps that this ET was just trying to make it easier for him to take her. Because she began to find evidence of this when she woke up several times to find her leggings on backwards. On one occasion she woke up to feel, quote, something pointed and plastic sticking out from my gum. And one day while brushing that spot with her toothbrush, this suspected implant came out. And she said it looked like a small, coiled, clear telephone almost, with a red thread running through it. She also noticed a strange mark on her nose that hadn't been there before. She began having problems with sleep paralysis. One time she woke up, she says, to see a, quote, a very tall, thin being, which was standing next to her husband's side of the bed. And as Natalie says, it seemed shocked and scared that I had woken up. Natalie's not sure why she's having these experiences, but she does report that her aunt and two of her uncles have also seen UFOs, and that one of her uncles is a colonel in the Air Force. She does report something else that she thinks is connected to all this, that she has very strong psychic abilities. There you go. And there were several reasons why I found that case credible. She reports the ETs telepathically communicating with her, telling her not to be afraid. She reports being healed of insomnia. She reports a huge boost in her psychic abilities. All these details are quite consistent with ET contact. I also found it interesting that her family has a history of encounters. Her uncle was a colonel in the Air Force, and there's a lot of interesting details to her case. But there you go, 7 cases from all over the world, each a little bit different, each similar in some ways. I think these similarities between cases that are far-flung from each other geographically speaking and in time argue for their credibility. These people are describing the same details, yet they don't know each other. They've never heard of each other's cases. Many of these cases are quite obscure. So, yeah, I think that does argue for their veracity. And each case almost always has some unique elements to it. Little details that probably don't turn up in the vast majority of cases. Hard to say for sure. There's so many of these events. I mean, any numbers, I would say, of how common this is vastly underestimated. I've said it 2 or 3 times already. Most people don't report their events with extraterrestrials, their face-to-face meetings. So we have to consider just how common is this? Probably a lot more common than people, even within the UFO community, believe. This is, again, such an important subject. We all deserve to know the truth. This cover-up cannot go on forever. Sooner or later, the truth is going to come out, and that's exactly what we're seeing. I find these humanoid cases super interesting because I do think they are the cutting edge of UFO research. It's really telling to me that while our governments will talk about UFO sightings or even crash retrievals, they have yet to approach the subject of people who are having direct contact. That speaks volumes. So there you go. Another episode outlining several humanoid encounters. And you can bet I've got more where those came from. So thank you again, you guys. I truly appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed the show, perhaps learned a little bit. Until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next Friday for the next episode of UFOs and the Paranormal.